Welcome to another lecture in this series on the history of New Orleans. I'm Bruce Baker, and today's topic is modernizing infrastructure, drainage, sewerage, water, and paving. Really exciting just history topics about the fabric of the city and how radically that changes in the early 20th century. So the main idea that I want to focus on today is that over quite a brief period at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, New Orleans made major improvements to the physical fabric of the city's public services of drainage, sewerage, water supply, and street paving. Now, I think it's important before we get into the exciting technical details about all the canals and pipes and so forth that were put in place and how that changes the physicality of the city and so forth, it's important to look at the really sort of broad context. And it's easy to think about pumps and technological solutions and so forth, but I would argue that none of this would be possible, none of this would have happened without the really big changes in politics that are happening at the time. So one thing is, very broadly, across the late 19th century, in these cases here that we're talking about in New Orleans, but also in a lot of other cities across the United States, across Britain, a lot of public services had been handled by private companies, and to varying degrees in different places and different examples, maybe particularly in these cases in New Orleans, the capacity of private companies to really provide an adequate public service is failing by the late 19th century. And as steady increases in population are happening, this just intensifies the pressures. So a sort of halfway solution that might have worked in 1840 or even in 1880 by 1900 simply is not working. It's also important to bear in mind the major political changes that are happening in Louisiana and New Orleans in this period. There's a really decisive election in 1896, and I talk about that in another lecture in this series about Martin Berman and the Choctaw Club. But the upshot of that election of 1896 is a new political machine in New Orleans around the regular Democrats, or the Choctaw Club as it's called. And this leads directly into disfranchisement of African Americans with the new state constitution that's put in place in 1898. And I would say that one of the things that we see here is something that we see in a lot of cases in the American South around this period, which is that coming out of the opposition to the federal government during the Civil War, of course, and then Reconstruction, we see a lot of opposition to sort of state government as long as it's controlled by Republicans, or as long as African Americans have a voice and a vote in that government. But once white supremacy is established pretty securely through disfranchisement and changing of constitutions and all these sorts of things in the 1890s and into the early years of the 20th century, we often see a sudden lack of opposition to the state government being more activist and interventionist and so forth. So essentially, once white people are in charge of state governments in the South and city governments, other white people are much more willing to give those governments more power. So I think we absolutely have to see these changes in infrastructure, even something as, simple or seemingly kind of uncomplicated as a new design for a pump to pump water and so forth. All that really needs to be seen in this broader context of progressive era reform in the context of white supremacy, particularly in the American South. Now, the first topic that we'll look at today is drainage, because in a lot of ways, if you're in New Orleans, drainage is the key issue. Somebody described New Orleans once as being a bit like a saucer floating in water, with the sense that the rim of the saucer is like the levees, Now, the good thing about the levees is they keep the water from the river and from Lake Pontchartrain out of the city. But the problem here is that the center of the saucer, the center of New Orleans, is lower than the water levels in the river and in the lake. So one of the things this means is that once water gets in, it's a bit difficult to get it out. And this is a sort of long history of trying to sort out the drainage in New Orleans and basically failing. So in 1794, Carondelet builds the Carondelet Canal, also known as the Old Basin Canal, and that runs essentially from just outside of the French Quarter at the end of Canal Street, unsurprisingly, and runs back and connects into Bayou St. John, which then empties out into Lake Pontchartrain. Canals in this period, it's important to remember that they serve sort of a dual purpose. They serve the purpose of transportation, but they also serve a bit of a drainage function. The problem, of course, is that, with the elevation issues, to some extent, you sometimes have to pump the water into the canals so that they can empty out. But the Carondelet Canal drains quite a bit of the old part of the city. It's eventually filled in during the 1920s, and that's why, if you're wandering around today looking for it, you're not going to find it. We get to the 1830s, and we get the New Basin Canal, which serves the American part of the city. And the terminus of that is a turning basin, that is to say a sort of big pool so that boats could turn about in a way they couldn't in the narrow canal. But a turning basin which was, if we think about it today, if you know where the train station is and you look across Loyola Avenue from there, the turning basin of the New Basin Canal was roughly there. Now, it followed part of what's now Interstate 10, and then it turns and goes into Lake Pontchartrain. This was part of a sort of larger vision or a larger plan for draining the city, but the Panic of 1837 comes along and sort of messes with that. And we sort of see a bit of a history of this where you have some good ideas, but unfortunately events come along and sort of disrupt that. So we see something similar to that happening in 1857, a sort of new, bigger plan for draining the city. But we get the Panic of 1857 and particularly the Civil War coming along. Now, what 1857 does leave is a legacy of the idea of drainage boards. That is to say, a body set up by city government that has the power to issue contracts to create drainage infrastructure, and importantly, the power to raise taxes to pay for those, and also to just sort of have a permanent part of the city government that's going to focus on drainage and not sort of let it get lost in the shuffle with all the other business. Civil War happens, that's a bit of a mess. In 1871, we see the Mexican Gulf Company, and this is supposed to excavate a ship canal. There's also a sort of drainage element to it. Gets very tangled up with Reconstruction politics, and the general consensus about this is that the Mexican Gulf Company is very good at collecting taxes. So there's the provision put in place to apply a small tax on everybody who lives in a certain drainage area to pay for the drainage infrastructure. And the Mexican Gulf Company is very good at collecting that tax, but they're not so very good at actually building stuff. Next big step is in 1876, and you'll notice that, when we're talking about sort of big steps in drainage in the 19th century, it's not a lot of actual drainage that's happening. That really sort of takes place in a bit of a bang at the end of the 19th century, but the pieces are sort of slowly, painfully falling into place. And the next piece that falls into place is 1876, and a drainage engineer named W.H. Bell comes up with a plan for how to do this, and that is basically going to be the foundation of later attempts to drain the city. And essentially, most of the actual drainage plan sort of follows that in terms of where things are laid out. And again, it's going to follow on from what we've already seen and drain things back to Lake Pontchartrain. There's an idea here that they're also going to run sewage through Bayou Bienvenue and out to Lake Borgne. That idea doesn't ultimately pan out. The whole plan that Bell comes up with in 1876 sort of stalls out due to politics. And we see a few other attempts in the 1880s built around different private companies, but really they sort of accomplish very little. The 1890s, though, is when it starts to happen. So 1892, we see a proper study of the city, looking at the nature of the soil everywhere, the elevation, the amounts of water that need to be moved from point A to point B, and what sort of pumping capacity is going to be needed, and so forth. So we get the kind of technical details in that study of 1892 that wraps up in 1895 to actually do something and have all the information that's needed. Then in 1895, L.H. Wood sets out a detailed plan based on this study, which sort of builds on Bell's 1876 plan and sort of goes beyond it. And the idea of Wood's plan is for a big canal along Broad Street. Now, I'm not sure how well this will come out, but you can see this essentially is Broad Street here. And the reason for this is that Broad Street is essentially the lowest point in the city. So they can use the gravity to some extent. And this big canal along Broad Street will be fed by sub-canals, and the sub-canals will be fed by the sort of open gutters that exist in the older parts of the city. And in the new expanding parts of the city, they're going to put in proper underground drains. Now this ties in to streets that are being opened, streets that are being paved, and sort of infrastructure work. As we all sort of know, it's better to dig the street up once if you can. So they're going to try in things like paving, eventually water supply and sewage and drainage and so forth once, rather than continue to dig things up. Because if we know anything about the city of New Orleans, it's that they don't like to dig up streets and sort of disrupt traffic. So another next stage here is in 1896. And remember, I said that there's a really key election. So there are these political changes that are happening in the 1890s that tie into this in important ways. But in 1896, the state legislature creates the Drainage Commission. It's also the same year that they create the dock board. So we see this sort of process happening of the state legislature doing the things they need to do to establish these structures in the city when they're things that go beyond what the municipal powers are. In 1899, there's a bond issue and a property tax that's levied to sort of fund the system so that you don't have to keep relying on sort of year-to-year politics and political struggles and so forth. So you sort of set up this sort of self-perpetuating funding system that's divorced from the day-to-day jockeying back and forth of politics. And unsurprisingly, once you have a proper finance system in place, you can actually start building things. And that's what happens, is we see the building of this drainage system beginning. You get the big power stations and the pumping stations at strategic places in that map that I showed a few minutes ago. The next sort of final thing that I'll mention is in 1913, A. Baldwin Wood, lots of people named Wood involved in this, which is slightly confusing, but A. Baldwin Wood invents a new kind of screw pump for lifting and moving water. This is a big deal, and it's a big deal not just in New Orleans, but it's a big deal everywhere worldwide that drainage is important, because it's a design that's then picked up and used elsewhere. So something that New Orleans has given to the world in this time, along with jazz, which is sort of happening at the same time and so forth. So that's pretty much the story for drainage. And now we'll switch to sewerage. And as the historian John S. Kendall said in the early 20th century, the history of the New Orleans sewerage system lacks all of the picturesque qualities of the drainage history. And I just thought that was such a great quote that it was worth including here. In the late 1870s, so this is a kind of disgusting topic, but sort of historically interesting, I suppose. In the late 1870s, there's no sewer system, right? So one prominent hotel in the middle of the city would sort of bribe the policeman who was patrolling to just sort of make sure that he was going for a cup of coffee or just somewhere else at midnight every night so that they could dump all their sewage in the gutter outside the hotel every night. So, just pretty disgusting. We really have to think that improving things like sewers and sanitation and rubbish disposal and so forth is a bit of a precondition for having any kind of a tourist trade in the 20th century. Of course, public health is the real concern. By the 1880s, there are a couple of businesses in the center of the city that have created private sewer mains that empty straight out into the river. And once that sewer main is there, it's relatively easy for other premises to connect to it. And, you begin to get a bit of a system would be putting it too strongly, but you start to get a bit of sewer service, but it's very haphazard and so forth, and only, is again sort of private as opposed to public. And into the early 1890s, what sewerage service there is controlled by a private company, and it's simply not really doing the job that it needs to. In 1899, that finance initiative that I mentioned in talking about drainage also covers sewerage and water supply. And so, again, once the money is in place and once the sort of political structures are in place, you can start making some actual progress. The state legislature creates the Sewerage and Water Board, and they decide against the Bayou Bienvenu and Lake Bourne plan and instead put the sewage into the Mississippi River. So you essentially have drainage going into like Pontchartrain, but sewerage going into the river because the idea is the river's really big and it flows and it sort of carries it away, and there's nothing really that they're worried about downstream. It's kind of disgusting, but it's a bit of an improvement, I suppose. They start building the sewer system in 1903. They start using it in 1907, and it's completed in 1908. Now, the next thing to look at is the water system and drinking water. The drinking water supply of New Orleans, drinking water supply of any place before sort of modern system, doesn't really bear thinking about. Rivers are, for reasons that we've sort of just covered, fairly nasty sources for your water supply. And it's, as we all know, sort of, from way back a long time ago to the current day, you can't overestimate the health significance of a clean water supply. Now, most of the water supply, before a sort of really good system comes about in New Orleans, comes from cisterns collecting rainwater. Now, plenty of rainwater in New Orleans most of the time, and this more or less sort of provides the needs. But one of the big problems here is that these cisterns are huge, every house, or not every house, but all over the place you have these cisterns of water standing, which are a perfect place to breed mosquitoes, which can carry yellow fever. So there are all sorts of reasons not to stick with cisterns and actually develop a proper water supply. It's included in the same legislation as sewerage and the 1899 funding bill and the board that's created. They start building the water system in 1907. It's partly in operation by 1908 and fully in operation by 1909. So again, I think the thing I would emphasize here is just how rapidly these systems change from a pre-industrial, medieval sort of drainage, sewerage, and water system to something that, with a little bit of change, we could recognize as being similar to what we have today. Probably in some cases, maybe no change. And the last thing that I want to emphasize here is the history of street paving. And in a way, street paving gets delayed since these other infrastructure projects were so urgent, and particularly drainage, because drainage without a proper drainage system, your street paving is going to have all sorts of problems. By the end of the 19th century, it's fair to say that New Orleans was not as well paved. Its streets were not as well paved as most other cities. And to be fair to the city and the city government, this is partly due to the nature of the soil. With this alluvial soil, it's very soft. There's no sort of nice sheet of clay or bedrock underneath there. So I suppose I'm not a paving engineer or expert, but it does sound like a fairly challenging sort of physical environment. The earliest paving of streets in the city was in Faubourg Sainte-Marie in the 1830s, and this is partly, to go back to an earlier lecture in this series, it's partly because the laws around, or ordinances around the use of the levee changed, and you could no longer leave goods sitting around on the levee forever. So you had to move the goods off the levee within a certain period of time. So there's more goods being moved around through the American sector, Faubourg Sainte-Marie. And Grevere Street is the first one to be paved. Now at this point, they're using a roadbed made out of about 12 inches of cinders and then topped with either granite blocks brought from Maine or cobblestones from Europe. I'm sort of assuming, it's not really clear from the sources that I've seen, but I'm sort of assuming that these things are coming in mostly as ballast for ships that are going to go out with grain and cotton and other goods. A few of the streets at this time in this sort of early phase are paved with 3-inch by 12-inch planks. Now, plank roads are quite common in the 1820s and 1830s, and that's largely because the United States, or large parts of the United States that are needing paved at this time, is an area that's well provided with wood, and so in some ways, once you sort of figure out a good way to saw it up, plank roads are as easy as anything. I imagine that these plank roads were probably cypress because there's a lot of cypress available near to New Orleans, and it's also a particularly rot-resistant wood, so it's a very durable sort of wood. Residential streets in this early period tended to be paved with crushed oyster shells and also clam shells coming out of Lake Pontchartrain, which would be laid over boards, not the sort of heavy boards of these planks roads, but sort of thinner, maybe 1-inch boards or so. Now the next big phase, the next big sort of advance in paving is asphalt. And asphalt is essentially a thick form of petroleum. So sometimes it's found in natural deposits, and in that form it had been used as early as the 1830s in France and in Britain. But in the US, as far as I can discover, it's really only significantly used once petroleum begins to be pumped in a significant way, starting at the sort of 1860s and really into the 1870s. So asphalt starts being used on streets for paving in the 1870s, and its first appearance in New Orleans is a short section of St. Charles Avenue in 1883. But this is very expensive, so $3.50 per square yard. So if you think about the size of an average street, that's going to be quite an outlay. So it's not really taken up at that time. Instead, there's a cheaper sort of clay and gravel mixture that's used that sort of basically gets the job done, but it's not very durable. And really, through the 1880s, there's not a whole lot of progress made. The next big advance in street paving, of course, comes in with Tar McAdam. So John McAdam, who's from Scotland in the early 19th century, comes up with a sort of system for paving roads which has to do with broken up stone of different sizes that's laid down in a particular way. From a really technical standpoint, I think this is really interesting. I'm not going to go into a lot of it here, but McAdam Road is basically laying down different layers of different size stones and sometimes stone dust to bind it together and so forth. This provides a quite a stable sort of surface, especially if you do some ditching to sort of keep the water from running along it and so forth. Now, asphalt or blacktop would be the terms used in the US, or tarmac in Britain, is basically a sort of stone aggregate laid out in the same way that macadam would do a road, but with asphalt mixed in and laid in layers and then compacted. So if we think about the sight of people working on roads nowadays and little machines laying the stuff down, then the big little rollers going over it and squishing it down, that's essentially what we're talking about. The difficulty in using this in New Orleans is there's no stone in the state of Louisiana, so you would have to import all of the stone. That's a bit of a difficulty. Also, the subsoil is so soft that if you just lay down the kind of roadbed and asphalt top that you would elsewhere, the softness of the soil underneath. And one of the things that we find is that as the soil gets drained, so as drainage, sort of turns the swamps into dry land that can be used for housing and so forth, it makes this soil less stable because the water in it was one of the things sort of holding it all up. And once you suck the water out, the soil starts to subside. So the subsoil makes paving very difficult, and the roads tend to sink and create ruts and so forth more than they might elsewhere. There was consideration of paving streets with blocks of wood, but that's really only going to work once you get a drainage system in place, because otherwise they're just going to loosen up and float away every time it rains hard, and that's going to be a problem. So the last thing that I want to look at in this context of street paving is just sort of the process by which it happens. And essentially, in this period, individual streets get paved when residents petition the city council. Now, this is a rough impression. I need more detail on this, but this is my understanding of how it works, and therefore it's very much tied in with city government and machine politics, and whether the people on your street remember to turn out and vote for the candidate that the Choctaw Club was putting up for ward boss and all this sort of stuff. So it's very much tied in with local politics. I have no doubt that there's all sorts of interesting deals being done and contracts being handed out for street paving. That's often the case. But by 1910, there were about 525 miles of street in the city as a whole, and about 268 miles of that was paved. So we've got a little bit over half of the street is paved by, half of the streets in the city are paved by 1910. And maybe the last important thing to mention is that around 1906, the city government seems to have taken over street maintenance and sort of created its own department within city government for handling the maintenance rather than contracting things out privately. And again, I would put that in the broader context of what we see happening at the tail end of the 19th century in the 1890s and into the first few years of the 20th century, of a move away from providing services through contracting with private companies and sort of bringing that stuff in-house to the city government. And this again is in the broader context of the progressive era. We see this happening all over the US. It's sort of the ideas coming out of Britain and sort of municipal socialism of places like Birmingham and Glasgow in the 1880s and so on. But the key thing in the American South, and certainly New Orleans fits into this, is that these sort of progressive era reforms are grounded in white supremacy. And that's a topic that I'll touch on a little bit more in the lecture on Martin Berman and the Choctaw Club. But that's it for this one.